G'day everyone, welcome back to ESPN Scrum Reset. It's Sam Bruce, joined as ever on this Monday evening by Christy Doran, here to wrap up round two of the Rugby Championship, where the script was flipped and wins for the All Blacks and Pumas in contrasting fashion over the Springboks and Wallabies, respectively. Christy, we'll get into that shortly, mate. How was your weekend otherwise?
Well, there was a wedding thrown in there on a Saturday, not my own, but I can tell you it made for a very bleary-eyed opening on a Sunday morning at 5 a.m. Australian Eastern. And look, I must admit, the early rise was made easier because you're reacting immediately to what the overnight result was between the Springboks and the All Blacks. And I wasn't too surprised that the All Blacks came back. I know that we'd, spoken about the fact that like even a Duane Vermeulen comes back and you go, geez, that's an imposing looking forward pack, but they're, pretty inexperienced hooker that was starting on, and you just got the feeling like it's now or never for this All Blacks group under Ian Foster. They love Ellis Park. They always seem to lift there, and it was only a few years ago, I'm pretty sure, that they absolutely hammered South Africa there. It might have been a 56-0 kind of scoreline, and that. I was expecting our response, but that was an unbelievable game. We'll get to it in a moment, but there's a lot to unpick there, and it makes for it, and it sets up what is a really enthralling next 4 weeks of this Rugby Championship. For the first time in a long while, talking about there is a lot at stake, and every week now the result is really significant.
Well, that's got to be the best thing to come out of the weekend, right? That we've got each team with one win. The All Blacks still on the bottom by virtue of not picking up a bonus point either in the defeat last week or the win at the weekend. I think it's clear that the Springboks and All Blacks are still the favourites to take out the title, and tough assignment for the Pumas now to head to New Zealand with perhaps not a wind, a sails full of wind, but a little bit of a gentle zephyr back in coming through their port side. I don't know why I'm going down the sailing avenue there, but we'll move on swiftly. And the Wallabies, of course, still hit hard by injury. They will get a few back, as we will come to shortly, hosting the Springboks team that probably got a little bit of a wake-up call, I think, on the weekend, as you mentioned, at home at Ellis Park, just under 62,000 fans baying for All Black blood, and as you said, received or actually got to watch a brilliant test match. So plenty to unpack. Let's go first to San Juan, though, where it was the Pumas 47-16 over the Wallabies, a complete and utter destruction job from Michael Checker's team there. And even, Check, you tip your hat to him. Certainly an excellent coaching performance, you would have to say. The Argentinians, they exploited the Wallabies back three ruthlessly under the high ball. And, we keep coming back to it, don't we? This problem position that is fullback, a different one just about in every test so far this year. We've now got Kurtley Beale potentially on the fringes this week. You're going to fill us in on the latest there. Perhaps Jock Campbell is an option. He isn't an option. We're certainly no clearer, though, to working out just who is the man to wear this number 15 jersey in what was an absolute thumping from the Pumas on Saturday.
Yeah, I think it was 48-17 there, not 47-17 rather. Oh, sorry to point that out, but
missed it. Point. Yep, thank you.
But we'll come back to the selections in a moment and look ahead to the rest of the Rugby Championship, because the squad was picked only for these Argentinian tests, of course, being away. Look, the game was won and lost, wasn't it, in the air, aerially, and it was pretty telling. And look, Tom Wright had a good performance the week earlier, but it was on the Thursday and the Friday that Wednesday of the previous week where I was getting some mail going Tom Wright starting at fullback. And yes, he went on to have a very good game that game. But two things. One, before that, which I highlighted, was it was very interesting that 3 minutes Jordan Bataille had before he was knocked unconscious in Brisbane, yet a project play, a plan, a long-term fullback in the making, someone who's considered one of the best in the air aerially in Australia, was not considered at fullback or not chosen at fullback, but instead chosen on the wing for the first test. I thought that was a very surprising and odd decision, to be frankly honest. It was surprising for a couple of reasons, but mainly because this is a guy who's been playing for the Reds, been spoken about for so long there, and to go away from that was simply odd, even though he might still be best on the right wing at the moment. I thought, clearly the benefit of hindsight, what we saw in this second test was Argentina exploited early on and then continually pepper it after gaining some initial success. But I'm not surprised by it. And in addition to that, the positional awareness was exploited too. And I don't understand how the Brumbies, for years, only played Tom Banks at fullbacks. There was a guy called Mac Hansen that also left because he was never given opportunities at fullback. Tom Wright was seldom given an opportunity. He wasn't given an opportunity before Tom Banks was injured / suspended for a tackle gone wrong in the West. How are the Brumbies in this case? But then, looking further ahead down the track, the Wallabies going, well, we need to see more of him at the Brumbies at fullback. And for the planning not to be there, I thought was staggering, considering that you've ended up going for him at fullback. Go on.
I was just going to say, how much of it on the weekend do you think was Ben Darwin, anyone who's kept abreast of the Australian rugby community in recent times, the work he does with Gainline, talks a lot about cohesion. He's built a business around it. And on the weekend, you've got a Brumbies fullback, a Reds winger, and a winger who's playing out of Japan. And these three guys, I'm not even sure they will have played together at test level before. Now, admittedly, this was part of this.
To be fair, they did line up there against England in Brisbane, albeit Patara at fullback and Wright on the wing.
But as you said, for what, the 12 minutes or whatever it was, before
3 minutes,
3 minutes there before Geordie was concussed. Now, part of this, as we discussed at length, that has been born out of the Wallaby squad being ravaged by injury through this period. Kellaway, and the list goes on. But there's just seemed to be a complete lack of connection there at the back. And is it too much to expect guys to come in and be able to do the pick up and go when they've trained together over the past couple of months, or do they need that actual time and the legs out there on the field? And is that what we saw? That was the result of that on Sunday morning.
I think we saw a bit of that because, of course, Anthony Seibold, the England defence coach, highlighted that well during Stan's coverage.
Thought he was excellent on Stan too, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I'm not surprised because he's done a lot of that stuff. Clearly he's a well-respected coach, but he's done a lot of those sorts of things for the NRL.com previously as well. That wasn't a surprise. But the fact that there weren't maybe the centres running back, putting themselves in that position, not necessarily to block runners, but just to be another obstacle. That had an influence, I'm sure, but I don't think it was the overall influence. We saw at times balls landing, getting in no man's land. There was once it looked like Nick White was going to go for it, didn't quite go for it. We saw Reece Hodge coming from 50 metres away, trying to get there, and ends up giving away a penalty towards the back end. Look, selection was a really interesting thing going into this second test, and clearly they were decimated, not helped by concussions at training. But even the decision at 10 with James O'Connor, 10, Lalakai Foketi at 12, it was surprising clearly they've been forced into something there at 12 with Lalakai Foketi, but I was staggered to, if you're not going to play James O'Connor the week before, you're not going to play him in Sydney and drop him, then to bring him back in a really pressured situation, I thought was interesting. To leave out Noah Loloseo completely over the two tests, I thought was staggering. To go in with a specialist centre on the bench, Ire Simone, he's about to leave to go overseas, I thought was absolutely mind-blowing. Perhaps one of the worst that is, to me, the worst selection I've seen under Dave Rennie, because this is a guy who's opted to go to France, leaving to France, was only here for the 2 tests, and he's a specialist centre when you've got a Reece Hodge who can cover the centres if necessary. Noah Lolacia's confidence must be absolutely rocked. He must be confused as anything, given what he's endured. He'd only led the Wallabies to a test match win only 3 or 4 tests ago in England, in Perth against England, and here he is, finds himself out of the 23 for a second straight week. Some really surprising decisions there, which I think kind of smacked a little bit of desperation and not knowing exactly what path you want to go on and how to actually get there. Quade Cooper's injuries absolutely rocked Rennie and the Wallabies, I think, and he's got a winning percentage rate of 70 from 50-odd test starts in the number 10 jersey. He was clearly someone that they were hoping is going to have a long, extended run through to the World Cup, but given his injury history and everything else, I think it was very surprising to potentially bank on that. But I would have been, and I still would continue having Noah Lolacia a part of the 23 going forward. And whether or not he starts or comes off the bench, I think it's important that he has minutes in him, particularly going into a World Cup. And we'll get to a little bit and who else might come into the selection frame at number 10 going forward. But, even Tom Robertson, this guy has got 20-odd caps of experience, or 18 caps of experience, but he's not found good enough to get on a bench when there's 1 cap of test experience between the 3 on the weekend, between Palmer Sealy and Billy Pollard on debut and a Matt Gibbon who's got 10 minutes a week earlier in Mendoza. I thought the experience of Robertson, given Alan Alatoa's departure, might have been significant, because we saw on the weekend, the set piece really struggle, and experience may have helped there.
Away from the high ball, I guess the other big theme we're seeing here with the Wallabies, and it has been the case virtually across the entirety of Dave Rennie's tenure, are these slow starts and having to play from behind. We saw it again on the weekend, that mix up at the back, and they're immediately, not chasing the game, but certainly behind and with the job to do. And I mean, the game, I think it was at 26-10 at halftime. Argentina might not be the Springboks or the All Blacks, but they're certainly bloody hard to beat at home. And to give them that much of a lead is always going to be, prove a very difficult task to run down, even though the Wallabies did something similar a few years ago. But before we move away from that, Sam, 16 of 25 tests under Dave Rennie, the Wallabies have trailed at halftime, and they haven't led at halftime since Japan at the start of last year's spring tour. It tells an absolute story. What's going on? Why can't they get out of the blocks quickly? Discipline's clearly an issue. It's and no one can quite put their finger on it. We asked Nick White a week ago, and he said he doesn't know. And fair play for being honest. And sometimes, there's these little strange intricacies around things in rugby and in sport, but this is more than just a theme now. I will say one thing, and I pointed it out last year in the second test in Melbourne, where the French were adamant that they would kick to Marika Korombete off every kickoff. And I asked Dave about that very fact at the full time. He said, look, we're not worried about that. But I actually think that affects the Wallabies' ability to exit with any great conviction. I think they get muddled up between whether Marika's going to run it outside the 22 or get tackled inside, a couple of phases blindside, and then Nick White goes to the boxy, and he hasn't been box kicking all that well of late. So, massive improvements need to be made there out of the gates. Otherwise, the record is as clear as you said, 16 out of 25. That's only going to get worse, you'd think. Yeah,
and look, you don't want to paint a doom and gloom picture necessarily. There are still positives coming out of there, and you can see you can take away things from every test. There's no doubt about it. But, the Wallabies haven't ever lost to Argentina as badly as what happened on the weekend. A 31-point absolute thrashing. It's not just a 10, a 15-point loss. 31 points is, quite frankly, embarrassing. This is an Argentinian side that's not ranked in the top 3 or 4 or 5. Yeah, a lot of injuries, undoubtedly, but the Wallabies' defence at times has to be questioned, and clearly a lot of those issues did come from the aerial inability to handle the aerial battle. But it would be remiss of us not to highlight a pretty significant moment in the game, which is when James Slipper is penalised after a rare bit of brilliance from James O'Connor and Jordan Petaia sniffing out some space, and it was reasonably sharp. You might question, are both balls forward? I thought probably fair if they're flat, but it was interesting, the James Slipper penalty and the decision to reverse the try. It would have put them in front 17-10 with O'Connor surely going to slot that from in front. So, they go on and they concede 2 quick tries in the matter of 7 minutes, which sees Argentina go in front 26-10. So what did you think of that when that occurred?
It's an excellent point, Christy. And I must admit, I did not get up at 5. Brittany Mitchell was on the job for ESPN, doing an excellent job, as she always does on Sunday morning. So I had a little bit of a lie until about 6:30 and then watched the game from then. And before I'd got to that incident, I'd actually been texted by mate Tom Hilliard. Hello to you, Tom, a recent convert to the pod, and saying it was, I think, a ridiculous decision, and my caught up. I had to agree. Now, what I did see today when I went back and watched it was the added clean out of Lockie Lonigan, which I think helped to spin Pablo around. Now, in no way did I think James Slipper's clean out was dangerous in any of the things we look for coming from depth at speed, leading with the shoulder, hitting in the head, neck roll. There was none of that. And I think the fact that Pablo actually was kind of holding on to the tackled player helped spin his motion, spin his body round for him to end up the way he did. If I was going to give a penalty, it would have been from Lockie Lonigan coming in the side after he'd made an earlier clean out and then kind of spun Matera's, I think it was his right leg round, and that added to it. But I mean, to scrub off the try for that was fairly confusing, even though, like you, I had major questions on both passes, probably the first one more than the second. So, yeah, look, am I surprised? No, I thought Carl Dixon actually had a pretty good game besides that. And the try that Argentina had disallowed that clearly appeared to be, compelling evidence for that ball to be overturned. Sorry, that try to be overturned by virtue of the ball scraping the line on the way through. So, I mean, we don't want to get bogged down in this, and I'm going to come and fire up with my South African friends that I've added to the pod via the Scrum Facebook page last week by saying Luke Pearce, I thought, had a fantastic game, but we'll get to that in a little while in Johannesburg. But yeah, confusing the Slipper incident. And there you go, Tommy Hilliard. We've covered it off for you.
Indeed, we did. Look, there's going to be changes, and those changes will be significant, you would imagine. I would suspect Andrew Kellaway will come back in at fullback. I think he's tracking well from what I'm hearing. Hunter Paisami, you imagine, would return at 12. Even though Lalakai Fekete had some okay moments in the game, I think he still brings a lot. There's a big question at 10 now with James O'Connor and Noah. There's going to be huge pressure on whoever gets there, particularly if it's James. I think the waters have been muddied, I think, by not having one of these two guys on the bench and giving them some time, because you actually don't get a real reflection on where these guys are at, because, O'Connor's cards might have been marked, but how many players were missing? What are the circumstances around that defeat that go into a performance which isn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination? In the forward pack, you imagine Alan Alatoa comes back, and I thought Taniela was underwhelming starting at 3. Now, whether or not some of the scrummaging issues occurred because the Lockie Lonigan comes in and perhaps not the best scrummager at this point in time, that's a consideration. You'd imagine Dave Parecki comes back in at 2. Aflao Faianga, who is out with concussion as well, comes onto the bench. And I think that will automatically see four changes in that squad. You might see a Rob Leota come back on the bench, and how they work out that 5-3 split or a 6-2 indeed will be interesting. But guys like Suli Vunivalu, where are they at the moment? Because Australians haven't seen him for a long time. You've barely seen him for the Wallabies, except for a couple of minutes in Sydney at the Sydney Cricket Ground. He's one of the best in the air. There's no doubt about that. But the absence of a short kicking game, I think, has been pretty telling at the moment. And when you look at what the All Blacks did on the weekend, a couple of things stood out. And there were one or two average kicks from Richie Mo'unga, but there was also a couple of good ones. And you think of the work that Adi Sevilla does out in the wing, and that short kicking game is so important to not only to manipulating defence, but also to being used as an attacking potent weapon. And it's gone out of the Wallabies' arsenal in recent weeks, in recent tests, because I'm surprised, firstly, but secondly, they opted not to do it against England because they were fearful for a Freddie Stewart at fullback. But hang on a moment, there's two wingers out in the field as well. So I'd love to see more of that and a more versatile game, because I think that's gone out of the Wallabies in recent weeks.
It's an excellent point, and something to really consider when you think about how the Springboks defend and how much they tend to use the rush defence there, led by whoever's at 13, probably Lukhanyo Am, who was brilliant. We'll get to him more shortly as well. A quick one before we wrap this up, and I guess looking a little bit forward to the Springboks as well. Fraser McReight, you'd have to say, was probably one of the better Wallabies on the weekend, if not perhaps as strong as he was last week. A pick and go early on, which got turned over when the Wallabies were hard on attack, springs to mind. But against the Springboks, when you have got such a giant pack, do you look to fight fire with fire and perhaps bring in a Pete Samu there at 7 ahead of Fraser McReight, or do you look to use Fraser's speed early on for a little bit of an edge, or is he perhaps loom as the perfect bench solution against the Springboks pack that might be tiring later on? Is there any chance you think we'll see Pete Samu next week?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think I like a side that backs their strengths, and you look at that Wallabies balance of the back of the forward pack. If you've got a Jed Holloway at 6 and a Rob Valentini, who was absolutely outstanding, the best player by a country mile from the Wallabies on the week.
Right, yep.
It's a pretty big forward pack there when you've got guys like a Alatoa with a Tupou to come off the bench, a Rory Arnold around there. I like Fraser McReight. I think he's a good player, and I think his point of difference is his speed, his link play, as well as his breakdown ability and natural instinct to go when to go for the ball. I can see the point. I wouldn't do that. But I floated it in a story today. Liam Gill's not had one phone call, and I know that he's someone that's been out of sight and out of mind for a long time. But he's an incredible player who's an outstanding 7 who has it all. And I know that people like Michael Hooper have always been big fans of him. Actually, recognise he was the most complete 7 in the game. I heard that just recently from one source, but. He's not been spoken to. Sean McMahon, I don't think, will come back. There was a fair bit of bad blood towards the end of last year's Rugby Championship with the fallout of the 3 Japanese base players, and he was one of the louder speakers. But he could have been someone who's very important. And when you look at the fact that Samu, Karevi, as well as Quade Cooper won't be there, it allows one more overseas base player to be coming into this squad and this Rugby Championship squad, which could be around the 34 number. You would imagine it'll be around that number. And I think from what I've been told, Bernard Foley could be coming back into the mix. I think there will be some medical checks that are done over the next couple of days. It doesn't necessarily mean that he'll come back into the squad, but I think he's at least on the radar, on the attention, given that Quade Cooper's injury will leave him out for a long, long time. And I don't think it's a bad idea. Having someone come in, you're getting an idea of them. You're not giving them a jersey. You're not giving them a starting position, but you're saying, how does this guy compare? Can he add to the squad? And that'll be really interesting. And similarly, Kurtley Beale probably will come back in. He was due back, I think, for the All Black test. Maybe he's progressing either quicker, or potentially they're going to want to necessarily have him come into the camp earlier so that they can roll him out at some point in time, and he's not necessarily having to catch up with the detail around things, as well as fitness and the rest of it. So really intriguing what happens over the next couple of days as the Wallabies try to iron out this squad.
Yeah, squad for those 2 tests against Springboks to be named towards the back end of this week, and those tests kick off in Adelaide, afternoon game at the Adelaide Oval, which I'm sure should be hopefully well attended down there. And then before we move back to Sydney with Allianz Stadium, as we keep saying, that we're all pumped up to see.
If you like this podcast and you're a fan of the AFL and AFLW, then you'll love the ESPN Footy Podcast, delivering insight and analysis with the help of champion data. Get it wherever you listen to your podcasts.
That's probably enough on the Wallabies and the Pumas. Let's head back to earlier Saturday night, Christy. And as we said earlier, the All Blacks turning the tables on the Springboks. Just another classic edition of this great rugby rivalry, wasn't it? Plenty of talking points, as we said. All Blacks under extreme pressure. Virtually, Ian Foster with his job on the line. We'll get to the bizarre kind of Sunday afternoon press conference shortly. Had to say nothing at all, or actually announce a press conference with the intention to say nothing at all and still proceed with it. I don't get it, but anyway. Mark Robinson, you can work that one out for yourself. Let's just cover off the match. I guess it took a while actually for any points to be put on the board, and this one was a real grind. Early yellow carding of Damien Willemse, and then we saw a couple of tries before the break, but the action really, I guess, went up a level in the second half, and it's hard to go past, I guess, the 2 big calls from Luke Pearce, which I may have infuriated those friends of mine in the Republic again today, but I think Luke Pearce got them both exactly right. Yellow card certainly for Beauden Barrett. I thought there was no probable try to be scored there by Jaden Hendrickse, towing the ball through. I thought he was roughly the same distance from where Richie Mo'unga was going to come across in cover. And then, of course, Lucanio Am's brilliant break that before he threw the long sweeping pass to Makazole Mapimpi, for a try that was also overturned for an earlier shepherd, or virtually a double shepherd from Hendrickse. I want to tip my hat to Luke Pearce and say, mate, job done, well done to all the officials, even TMO as well. 2 big calls, and I thought they got them absolutely spot on.
Yeah, I agree, and it's not often we're able to talk positively about officials, and I even tweeted it out after the game because I thought Luke Pearce, he was clear, he was concise, his communication was spot on. He allowed the game to flow, but he also wanted the game to flow, which was really refreshing. He was telling people and players to hurry up to get to a scrum, and
he's a ref that looks like he's loving every minute of it. No matter what's going on, this is where he wants to be. There's a big smile on his face. He has the odd joke with players there at times. I mean, Scott Barrett just springs to mind now, was yelling at him to check a try there, and then moments later, the All Blacks scored anyway, and I think they had a good chuckle about it. I just love his approach, his attitude. Yeah,
and there was a moment that Justin Marshall highlighted as well, and I was watching it with someone else, and they said, such and such is hurt. And why wasn't it blown up immediately? And it was very smart officiating, because I think Luke Pearce had observed that the ball was being turned over at the process at the time, that New Zealand were going to be able to clear their own line, and that there wasn't going to be any present danger for that particular player who may or may not have been injured. I thought it was fantastic refereeing. And as it turned out, the ball was cleared, and it just allowed, otherwise the game would have been stood still. New Zealand probably wouldn't have got that moment and that opportunity to win the ball there. Maybe a scrum is called, but I thought he was brilliant. And you're right, I thought the decisions that he made, the big moments were made. He immediately went to the pocket for Williams for professional foul play, which is slowing the ball down, cynical play there. There wasn't any toing or throwing. There wasn't any TMO called in. No, this was a pretty obvious yellow card. It was done immediately. No points were scored shortly after. So those that are blaming the referee for that decision, I think you need to just look at the game again with a clearer set of eyes, perhaps. But but there was definitely a double obstruction there with Sam Whitelock unable to go into a tackle where space was run into. Arguably the pass from arm at the end was also forward potentially, but I would have been happy for that to be play on. But definitely it was obstruction. There was no doubt about that. And as for the yellow card to Beauden Barrett, once again spot on. They didn't deliberate it for too long. There wasn't a certain try possible, so I thought he was excellent. And the more that we can see there, the more emphasis for just to speed the game up can only be a good thing, because it'll mean that players get more tired. And when players get tired, space tends to open up, and it allows people, the little players, the more creative players, those that play on instinct, to be able to come into the game, because we know that it's such a collision-based game at the moment. So stop-start in its nature that it really suits a Springboks kind of pack or side that is known for its bomb squad. Both teams missed opportunities in the first half, but it was an outstanding game, and one where clearly the All Blacks played for their coach as well. And what happens now with Ian Foster is going to be really, really surprising and fascinating to see what happens, because clearly Mark Robertson hasn't issued any kind of vote of confidence there. Maybe there was a last minute change from the board. Maybe they were waiting for him to come home to New Zealand before delivering anything. But every hour that the clock ticks is an hour lost to perhaps make a change. The question which I would ask you, Sam, and something that Stuart Barnes has brought to attention is, would a win like this, where players are clearly up for it, the intensity is there, has that potentially masked the overall shortcomings of a Ian Foster coached All Black side, and perhaps in 6 to 12 months, if he continues and he plays 4 tests against Argentina and Australia, which you would expect they would win the vast majority, if not all of those, would that mask the shortcomings going forward and potentially come back to haunt them in 13 months' time at the next World Cup?
Well, it's a question, Christy, I guess, how many chances do you give a coach? And if you reflect on the last few years, the All Blacks, we think back to that loss to the Pumas here in Sydney. Wallabies should have beaten them in Wellington before beating them in Brisbane a few weeks later. They've lost to Ireland 3 times across the last few years, lost to France last year, dropped a test to South Africa here in Australia when the Rugby Championship was played all but a couple of weeks in Queensland. And of course, last week as well, when they looked, particularly flat, and Foster came out and said, well, that was our best performance of the year. Now, I think that generated a lot of laughter, and he admitted that himself last week. But maybe the clues were there that he had seen something the rest of us didn't, because they certainly came out and played like the All Blacks we know and have come to expect, certainly through the Steve Hansen and Graham Henry era, when they were, winning around 89, 90% of their matches. So, yeah, look, defiant the players are, aren't they? Artie Sevilla, strong in his support of Ian Foster after the game. There's pictures of him sharing a real emotional embrace with Aaron Smith. I've no doubt that the players are behind him. But, it's a massive call for New Zealand rugby, isn't it? And there are calls. Jamie Wall, I think, last week writing, sack Foster, and while you're at it, after you've done that, sack yourselves, New Zealand rugby. So, look, it's a massive call for New Zealand rugby, and these guys these men and women who are making it in the next couple of days are going to be remembered for it, because they are on that harder side of the World Cup draw, aren't they? That has the top 4 that will be playing off in the quarterfinals, or the top 4 rankings at this point in time. There's a real risk that they could go out in the quarters. Do you start again with Scott Robertson, as we've suggested over the last, umpteen episodes of the pod, virtually under 13 months and ticking virtually today, I think it is, until kickoff there in France. So, yeah, look, if it was me, I'd be making the change. I still think that what we've seen from the All Blacks over the last few years, comparatively to previous years, I still think they've got the cattle they need in a vast majority of positions, and I don't think Ian Foster, the way he's chosen teams along the way, or the kind of rugby he's had them playing at times has been up to scratch.
Yeah, I'll continue on that in a moment. I just wanted to highlight, I thought Shannon Frizzell was outstanding on the weekend. And
been good since coming in, yeah.
Having a blindside flanker who...
Toke Aho too, I think he's proven himself that...
He's a real find, isn't he? He'll be a great player going forward. But, having a 6, in the Jerome Kino kind of mould is so important because they offer brutality and physicality, which you need. You can't just have it, particularly when you don't have a Brodie Retallick there. So, probably finishing up regarding the Robertson and the move there, if it's going to take place, I don't think it's too late yet before the World Cup. We saw Michael Cheika have a really positive influence for the 2015 World Cup when he came on at the spring tour. I think you give him the Rugby Championship. I think it's too late at this moment. The only thing that you're potentially, I think, jeopardising, and maybe not, is the Bledisloe Club. It's whether or not you think that is in real jeopardy or not. And if it's not, I think you give him until the rest of the Rugby Championship, and then you go, you know what, they've got to be absolutely clinical over these next 4 tests, and then if they're not, then you make the change. And it would be difficult, but I just think that you're doing it a week and a half before a couple of tests against Argentina. It's a real tricky one. But on the other hand, it might allow a new coach to be able to come in and bank a few victories, get some rapport before you go into a series. Look, we're not the ones making the decisions. We don't necessarily know the ins and the outs of it. Clearly, it seems like the players are behind him, and that's a really, really important thing. So the only thing it really reflects badly on, I think, at the moment is not so much Ian Foster, who's probably doing everything he can, but is the New Zealand Rugby Board, and that's headed by Mark Robertson. And they've got some real accountability that they should be facing at the moment, because the press conference that they called over the weekend was farcical, and it was clearly in response to their decision not to speak to the media for 5 days following the Irish series loss there. So, look, you can't call a presser and then say nothing, and you either back him or you don't. And we saw and we heard neither of that. It means that there's negative headlines for another week, big decisions to be made. But look, it opens up this Rugby Championship, and that's what I think was disappointing as well about the Wallabies' performance, because if they can somehow leave San Juan with a victory there, they come back with 2 victories. They're on top of the Rugby Championship. They potentially can afford to drop one of the next 4, but they can't now, really. And that really, there's a lot of pressure now on Dave Rennie. There's a lot of pressure regarding the strength and conditioning. If there's any more injuries in training, well, I can tell you what, there will be more people that will be concerned, other than 1 or 2 journalists or a few punters that are really now catching on that this is not right. There will be serious questions being asked by Rugby Australia, which I think there already is, by the way.
2 things just before we wrap up. Let's give a wrap, I guess, to at least the management or the reporting of these concussions, because probably in previous eras, some of these might have been swept under the rug, and no slight on any coach or any team around the world, but it was just the kind of space that we were in, that the game was in, and all contact sport was in at that point, that some of these head knocks, that the Hunter Paisami one that you first reported on Wednesday last week wasn't even picked up during the game. He reported that himself, feeling the symptoms on the Sunday, failed the cognitive test, they call it, on the Monday, and then Folau Fainga on match eve on Saturday morning Aussie time. So, I think we've got to give them a rap for managing both the players, for realising, this is extremely serious stuff, and team management and doctors and everyone involved for then sitting them, given the circumstances. The second thing, you're looking on the All Black situation. You'd back them to, as impressive as that Pumas performance was on the weekend, that they should win both these games against Argentina, you would think, not with relative ease, but I think they'll be comfortable victors in both. Then they get the Wallabies here in Melbourne, which probably looks the toughest test of their remaining games, clearly, before they return to Fortress Eden Park. Now, one particular Aussie journalist found it the right time to lay claim to the Bledisloes coming home last week. And of course, the reaction from Australian rugby fans on social media wasn't great. But looking at it from a New Zealand perspective, I mean, that's clearly, and who knows what Wallabies team you might get at Marvel Stadium that night. If you're making the judgment on the next 4 weeks of the Rugby Championship, given what we've seen previously, I think that's a dangerous situation for New Zealand rugby to be in.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and you're right. And firstly, regarding the concussion, I completely agree with you there. That's a really good point. It's a valid point. I would wonder whether or not other international teams or other teams across, provincial, domestic competitions are doing the same. Really, we can't get to the bottom of that now, but it's a really interesting question. Look, I thought the timing regarding that article was odd, but it wasn't the only one. Look, there was one in the Sydney Morning Herald saying that the irony is that the All Blacks are probably the most vulnerable that they've ever been, and that's true. I just thought that maybe you write those stories before the Rugby Championship starts, not after a couple of weeks, particularly when there's the next test is against the Springboks and not the All Blacks. I thought that was odd, given that there's all the injuries, given the players that had left Argentina as well. I think that was fascinating, bizarre timing regarding that. But there's a lot to play out before this Bledisloe series, and you're right that the Melbourne Test will be the hardest one that they now face. Michael Cheika probably goes to New Zealand going, well, there's let's just leave it out there. We're going there with no real expectation. He's not going there with the Bledisloe Cup up for grabs, is he?
No.
So why not? He should know them pretty well. He should know their vulnerabilities, and he knows that to win, you'll have to be physical, and that's what they will be.
Interesting footnote. Yes, Michael Cheika returning to New Zealand, given some of the ways he's been depicted in the New Zealand media previously. It'll be interesting to see whether they try and wind him up at all now as coach of Los Pumas. And Cheika, certainly, as you say, won't be carrying the burden of trying to end Australia's Bledisloe Cup drought. Right, mate, that's a pretty good wrap for Monday night. Thanks again for your time. Enjoy the weekend off. I'm not sure what you've got plans, maybe a little getaway with the missus, treating that lovely girl of yours to a dinner out, perhaps. Anything on the cards?
Won't be on the cards, that, because she'll be off to Europe, unlike some of us. So, look, I'm looking forward to a weekend off. There's no doubt about that. But there's a couple of really interesting storylines that will be bubbling away over the next few days. So lots of rugby to kind of be interested by, fascinated by, and look, that Adelaide Test is going to come around quickly, and I, for one, am looking forward to getting there and seeing what it's like on another oval shape. So you're not going to quite have the atmosphere there, but clearly the Sydney Football Stadium just around the corner there, and the unveiling there. So that'll be great and highly anticipated.
Yeah, can't wait for that one. And I'm actually headed bush this weekend to watch the mighty Coonabarabran and Kookaburras push for a grand final win on the road in Molong. So come up and say hi if you're a fan of the pod in Molong on Saturday afternoon.
Well, good luck. Enjoy that. And Shoot Shield coming around as well to the pointy end there. Lots to look forward to. Finals footy around the corner. So, yeah, get out, watch, enjoy the rugby. Lots to look forward to. Yeah,
a bit of local footy indeed, just what the doctor ordered. Right, mate, thanks again, and we'll talk to you next week.